Alright, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, or Application and Website Development program, and in particular the AWD 1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class, I'm creating a series of video presentations based on the textbook we're going to be using for the class for the fall 2019 semester. That textbook, as shown on screen here, is Pro ASP.NET MVC 5 in A-Press text by Adam Freeman. We're working our way through the book, and we are currently in Chapter 15 of 27. And in particular, I'm on the bottom of page 399. We're talking about constraining routes. As the author says here, at the start of this chapter, we described how URL patterns are conservative in how they match segments and liberal in how they match segment content. The previous sections explain different techniques for handling different types of conservatism. Now, as the author says, it's time to look at how to control the liberalism in matching the content of the segments. In other words, how to restrict the set of URLs that a route will match against. Once we have covered both of these, we can create URL schemas that basically should always work. All right. The first technique is using regular expressions. So there is an example in route config that's shown right here. Constraints are defined by passing them as a parameter to the map route method. Like default values, constraints are expressed as an anonymous type, where the properties of the type correspond to the names of the segment variables they constrain. In the example right here, we've used a constraint with a regular expression that matches only where the value of the controller begins with the letter H. All right, hopefully you remember this. That's the beginning character. So it says begins with H. The dot star means followed by anything. Default values are applied before constraints are checked. So for example, if I request the URL /, the default value for controller, which is home, is applied. The constraints are then checked, and since home begins with an H, it'll work. Regular expressions can constrain a route so that they specify only the values for a URL segment that will cause a match. We do this using the bar character shown here. In this particular example, it will allow a match to only URLs where the value of the action segment is either index or about. All right. Next, routes can be constrained so that they match a URL only when it is requested using a specific HTTP method. So in this case, we've got it with GET. The format for specifying an HTTP method, as it says there, is a bit odd. It does not matter what the name is given to the property as long as it's assigned to an instance of the constraint class. In the listing here, we called it HTTP method. We could have called it Ralph, and it would have worked fine. It does make sense, though, as the author has shown, to give it a name that goes along with what it is you're trying to do. All right. Turning up to the top of page 402, you'll see that most of 402 is another unit test, which again I'm skipping. And I'm moving down to the bottom of the page using type and value constraints. The MVC framework contains a number of built-in constraints that you can use to restrict the URLs a route matches based on the type and value of segment variables. We look here. To do that, we have to add a using statement in our route config. All right. In that particular example that you see right here. So we're using the system.web.mvc.routing.constraints namespace, which will check if segment variables for values are different C# types and perform what other types of basic checks. In the listing, we use the range route class, and that's down here. which checks that the value provided for a segment variable is a valid integer between 10 and 20. And they show some extra examples down here on the bottom of the page. Again, I'm not putting, and I guess the top of the next page, I'm not putting all these in, all right, because all I'm doing is mucking up, so to speak, my route config file by doing this. You can combine different constraints for a single segment variable, and they show an example of this down toward the bottom of page 404. In this listing, it says we've shown how to use this feature to apply both an alpha route constraint and a minimum length route constraint to the ID segment variable to ensure that the route will match only string values solely alphabetic that have at least 6 characters. All right, on page 405, defining a custom constraint. Well, as it says, if there's not a standard one that meets your needs, you can define your own. To demonstrate this feature, the author added an infrastructure folder to the example project and created a new class file in there called userconstraint.cs. Let's try it. So let's come in here, and like we did before with additional controllers, let's right mouse click on here on the name of our project, choose add, choose new folder, and we want to call this infrastructure. Infrastructure. And inside of here we want to create a new class. We're going to call that new class useragentconstraint.cs, and we're going to change the text inside of there so that it matches what's shown here on page 405. Pretty this up a tad so it's a little easier to read. Alright, I prettied it up, but it is the code that's shown on the middle of page 405. The iRoute constraint interface defines the match method, which is an implementation we can use to indicate to the routing system if its constraint has been satisfied. So on 406, they mention here that we have to go back into our route config file. Tell you what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the other ones that I put in here, except for the bottom one rather. I don't know what I just did, and comment that out. All right. So to use this, the first thing we're told to do, okay, that's not what I wanted to do. First thing we're told to do right here is to come in and add a using statement using URLs and routes.infrastructure. Now, doesn't like something here, so let's look. URLs and routes. And there's infrastructure. I'm not sure why it doesn't like that, but it didn't appear to, at least. And under our register routes, we're going to add this one first. Telling us to put that in. Now, all I can think of is when I set this up, all right, when I did set this up, it's giving me an error here because that's defined in here. So we've got our infrastructure and we've got our user constraint. Well, I must have defined it incorrectly. Not sure what the problem is, but it's not letting me go on, so I'm just going to hold off on that one. Apologize. Usually when I have a problem like that, it's something fairly simplistic, which is why I have trouble with it. All right. Let's move on to using attribute routing on the middle of page 407. I'm at 12 minutes. I think that's a decent enough place to stop, and I will pick it up there with the next presentation.